Air France, Flight 447, a massive Airbus A330 passenger plane, met its tragic end in the most horrifying way, and it all happened in only 4 minutes. It hit the Atlantic Ocean like a stone dropped from the sky. It hit the Atlantic Ocean with the same force as crashing into a 46-story building. The plane was falling incredibly fast, dropping 10,900 feet every minute. Through the pitch black night inside the cockpit, as warning alarms rang out, 2 pilots tried everything they could to save the plane, but it was too late. The huge aircraft smashed into the ocean at a steep 45-degree angle, breaking into thousands of tiny pieces. In just one terrible moment, all 228 people on board were gone. In this video, we'll take a look at each detail how this tragic accident happened. So let's dive straight into the video.
What's happening? I don't know what's happening. We're losing control of the aircraft here. We lost all control of the aircraft.
Let's start with the people who would fly this important route. The crew landed in Rio de Janeiro on May 28, 2009, planning to stay for 3 days before flying back to Paris. The team had 3 pilots, each with different levels of experience. The main captain was 58 years old and had flown for an impressive 11,000 hours. That's like spending nearly 458 days in the air. Of those hours, 1,700 were on the exact same type of plane they'd been flying that night, the Airbus A330. The youngest pilot was a 32-year-old first officer. He was newer to flying, with 3,000 total hours and just 800 hours on this type of plane. He'd only gotten his license to fly the A330 the year before. In 2008, the third pilot, who they called the relief pilot, was 37 years old and actually had the most experience with this specific plane, 4,500 hours on the A330 out of his total 6,500 flying hours. Here's something interesting. The first officer brought his wife along for the Rio trip. This might seem like a nice detail, but it suggests he probably didn't get much rest before the big flight. And rest would be crucial because this wasn't going to be an easy journey. The flight was scheduled to leave Rio at 8 p.m. local time. That's 11 p.m. in Paris. This timing meant the crew would have to fly through what pilots called the window of circadian low. Basically the time when our bodies naturally want to sleep. The flight would take 12 hours and 45 minutes. Which is why they needed 3 pilots who could take turns resting. The aircraft they were flying was an Airbus A330-203, delivered to Air France in 2005. Think of it as a flying computer, super advanced and loaded with safety features. Before taking off, they loaded it with 70.4 tons of fuel, making sure they had extra in case they needed to dodge any bad weather. Now here's where things get technical but important. The plane had these crucial devices called pilot tubes. Think of them as the plane's speedometers. They look like the little tubes sticking out of the nose of the plane, and they measure how fast the aircraft is flying by checking the pressure of the air flowing into them. These tubes were heated to prevent ice from forming, but there was a problem. In the previous year, Air France had reported 9 different cases where these tubes got clogged with ice crystals in bad weather. The company that made the plane, Airbus, knew about this and had created better tubes that wouldn't clog so easily. Sadly, Flight 447's plane was scheduled to get its new tubes after it landed in Paris, an upgrade that would never happen. The flight path would take them through something called the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or ITZC. Imagine a place where giant thunderstorms grow as tall as 60,000 feet. That's higher than any commercial plane can fly. These storms over the ocean were especially tricky because they didn't show up as clearly on the plane's weather radar as regular storms. Inside these clouds lurked another danger: super cold water droplets. These aren't frozen yet, but the moment they hit something like those important pilot tubes, they freeze instantly. At 22:29 UTC, Flight 447 took off from Rio with 216 passengers and 3 pilots. Everything seemed normal as they climbed to their cruising height of 35,000 feet. The relief pilot took his scheduled rest first, heading to the crew bunk beds behind the cockpit. Around 4 hours into the flight, things started changing. At 2:06 UTC, pilots warned the cabin crew about upcoming turbulence. They were flying into complete darkness with only the moon behind them. The captain had just left for his rest break, leaving the 2 first officers in charge. The weather radar showed storm clouds ahead, and the pilots discussed climbing higher. But at 35,000 feet, they were already close to the plane's limit. The air is so thin up there that the engines can't produce much extra power if needed. They decided to stay at the current height, but turn slightly left to avoid the worst of the weather. 2:08:17, the cockpit voice recorder picked up the sound of rain hitting the windscreen. Then something strange happened. the temperature in the cockpit suddenly went up, and the pilots noticed a weird smell. A relief pilot recognized it as ozone, a sure sign they were in the thick of a powerful storm. 20 seconds later, they could hear ice crystals hitting the plane. Everything changed at 2:10:05. The autopilot and automatic engine controls suddenly turned off, setting off loud alarms in the cockpit. A strong gust of wind made the plane bank sharply to the right. The first officer called out, "I have controls," and grabbed his control stick. In the second, then the worst happened. All three airspeed indicators started showing different speeds. On the captain's display, the speed dropped from 275 knots to just 60 knots in seconds. Clearly wrong. The pitot tubes had gotten clogged with ice crystals. Without reliable airspeed information, the plane's computers couldn't protect against dangerous flight conditions anymore. The system switched to something called alternate law 2, which meant many safety features were turned off. The first officer, probably startled and confused, made a crucial mistake. He pulled back on his control stick, making the plane climb higher. This might seem like a good idea when you're worried about falling, but at high altitude, it's extremely dangerous. The plane climbed rapidly but lost speed, eventually entering what pilots call a stall, where the wings can't produce enough lift to keep flying.
What are you doing? What's happening? I don't know what's happening! We're losing control of the aircraft here! We lost all control of the aircraft!
Despite clear stall warnings, the pilots never fully understood what was happening. For 3.5 terrifying minutes, the plane remained stalled, dropping at almost 11,000 feet per minute. The captain rushed back to the cockpit, but in the darkness and chaos, even his experience couldn't save the situation. At 2:14:28, Air France Flight 447 hit the Atlantic Ocean at high speed. All 228 people on board lost their lives instantly. The first officer who was flying the plane suddenly found it much harder to control. The controls became twice as sensitive, which meant small movements had bigger effects. He started making too many corrections, causing the plane to sway left and right as he tried to keep it steady. During this struggle, he began pointing the plane's nose up in the sky. Right after these issues started, a stall warning briefly went off in the cockpit. The third pilot, who was there to help the long flights, asked, "What is that?" Maybe because the warning was so quick or because he didn't know what it meant, the pilots should have turned off their guidance screens according to the rules, but they didn't. These screens went blank anyways because they weren't getting good information from the sensors. In just 11 seconds, the plane's nose was pointing up at an 11-degree angle. The first officer was moving his control stick all the way left and right, still trying to stop the swaying. He told the others they didn't have good screen information, probably talking about their lost speed readings. The third pilot announced that they had lost their speed indicators and were in backup mode. He tried to read all the warning messages, but he was talking so fast that no one could understand him. It was very important for everyone to know that the plane was in backup mode because this meant that it could handle very differently and had lost its safety features. The third pilot mentioned that they lost automatic engine control. The first officer seemed confused and asked, "Engine lever?" When the automatic system turned off, the engines got stuck at 84% power. The warning system told them to control the engines manually, but instead the first officer just pressed the disconnect button and left the power where it was, which made the engines give even more power for climbing. All of this happened in just 18 seconds. The cockpit was crazy with noise. 10 different warning messages were showing up, each making its own alarm sound. Warning lights were flashing everywhere, and there was a constant beeping because they had left their assigned height. This made it very hard for the pilots to think clearly. The plane's nose kept going up until it reached 12 degrees. They were climbing incredibly fast, going up at 6,900 feet per minute, which is 7 times faster than usual. As they passed 36,000 feet, going up this fast meant that the plane was losing forward speed, which is very dangerous when you're already so high up. The guidance system came back on briefly, but made things worse by trying to keep this dangerous climb rate. This is exactly why they were supposed to turn these screens off. They can give bad advice in unusual situations. The third pilot finally noticed how steeply they were climbing and shouted, "Watch your speed." The first officer said he would go down, but he didn't make big enough corrections to fix the problem. By now, the plane had lost about 50 knots of speed and was still slowing down. In a strange move, the first officer reduced engine power to 85%, showing he was probably getting confused about what was happening. The third pilot kept trying to call the captain back to the cockpit. When the stall warning started and kept going for 45 seconds straight, surprisingly, neither pilot really paid attention to this warning. Instead, the first officer pulled back even more on the controls, making the noise point up at 16 degrees, as steep as a plane taking off. This made the tail go as high as it could, making it even harder to recover control. The plane couldn't climb anymore. It started to level off, but was still swaying side to side as the first officer fought with the controls. They were about to completely stall, which means that wings wouldn't be able to keep the plane in the air anymore. While both pilots had practiced near stalls in training, they had never experienced a real complete stall in an actual plane. The fact that the Airbus only made a sound for stalls instead of making the controls shake or showing clear visual warnings might have made it harder for the stressed pilots to understand what was happening. When the captain finally got back to the cockpit, everything was chaos. The plane was dropping fast, lots of warnings were going off, and the whole aircraft was shaking violently. Even with all three pilots trying to understand and control things, they never really understood they were in a deep stall. The confusion got even worse when the stall warning system started acting strangely, warning when they pointed the nose down, which was actually the right thing to do, and stopping when they pointed it up. In the final moments, as the plane fell through 2,500 feet, multiple warning systems were telling them to pull up. Both pilots pulled back on their controls, raising the nose to 16 degrees up, but it was too late. The plane was falling straight down at 107 knots, which was the same speed it was moving forward. The first officer made one last desperate attempt, pull up while crying out. At 2:14:28, Air France 447 hit the Atlantic Ocean at a 45-degree angle, falling at 10,900 feet per minute. Hitting the water was like falling from a 46-story building. The plane broke into thousands of pieces, and all 228 people on board died instantly. This terrible accident led to big changes in flying. The investigation showed that while no parts actually broke, the temporary loss of speed information started a chain of events that the crew wasn't ready to handle. The first reaction to point the nose up made things worse, and they never understood or recovered from the stall that followed. Airlines now require new training for pilots, including practice with high altitude stalls and unusual situations. They created new rules for handling unreliable speed readings, focusing on keeping the plane flying straight and level before trying to fix other problems. The accident also led to suggestions for cockpit cameras, better flight recorders, and improved search and rescue methods. The biggest lesson for pilots was the need to really understand how their planes worked, especially when flying very high up. The most important rule stays the same. Focus on flying the plane first. Set the right nose angle and engine power to keep flying safely. Then work on fixing any other problems. As long as the plane stays in the air, there's time to figure out what's wrong. We use Afterrender to produce our YouTube videos, the top company for YouTube video production.